Good morning, students of class 9 and also of class 10. Today we will take up the next short story in our syllabus, and the name of this short story is A Face in the Dark, written by famous Indian author Ruskin Bond. So, before we begin with the text of the story, let us at first take a look at some scenes from this story. First and foremost, on your screen, you will see this illustration of a boy sitting on a rock in the middle of the wilderness, and it's night, and the face of this boy is not visible because it is dark. And yet another scene taken from the story where you see the night watchman with a lantern in his hand. So these two are symbolic of what happens in the story, particularly the supernatural aspect of the story. So let's now take a look at the introduction of this short story by Ruskin Bond. On your screen, taken from your textbook, we have an introduction about the author. Ruskin Bond, an Indian author of British descent, is a prolific writer whose works are popular with adults and children alike. In the following story, writer Ruskin Bond relates a thrilling incident set among the picturesque hills around Shimla. Ruskin Bond's fascination with the paranormal finds expression in this macabre tale. Now, the story: Mr. Oliver is a school teacher. He's an Anglo-Indian teacher. He's a bachelor, and he's on his way back to school late one night when he meets a strange young boy. The encounter or this meeting fills him with terror, and he takes to his heels, only to discover that there is no escape for him. Ruskin Bond makes skillful use of all the elements of a horror story: fear, surprise, suspense, and mystery, to explore humanity's collective fascination with the dark. So this is what your textbook says about Ruskin Bond and about the story. Now here we have an excerpt taken from your Treasure Trove workbook, and it is the critical appreciation of the story, Layers of Meaning in A Face in the Dark. This is very important. The short story by Ruskin Bond, on one level, can be read as a paranormal one, with the faceless boy and watchman as two ghostly figures haunting the protagonist or the hero, Mr. Oliver. On a deeper level, now this is very significant, this is very important. On a deeper level, it can be read as unraveling the mysteries of human experience. Ruskin Bond believed that no matter how rational a person is, how logical, how rational, how realistic in his thoughts a person is, there is always an element of superstition in his mental makeup. So I suggest that you go through this critical remark or remarks made by the editor of your workbook, and this will give you some insight into the story. Also remember that the main theme of the story is supernaturalism. Supernaturalism, which is brought in by, as we saw in the introduction in your textbook, horror, suspense, fear. All these are ingredients of supernaturalism in this short story. So now let's take a look at the text of the story, A Face in the Dark, Chapter 5, written by Ruskin Bond. Mr. Oliver, an Anglo-Indian teacher, was returning to his school late one night, on the outskirts of the hill station of Simla. So we must remember that Mr. Oliver is the chief protagonist of the story. He is a school teacher by profession, and he is an Anglo-Indian, and he was returning to his school late one night. And where was he? On the outskirts of the hill station of Simla. From before Kipling's time, the school had been run on English public school lines, and the boys, most of them from wealthy Indian families, wore blazers, caps, and ties. Now, Kipling here refers to famous English author born in India, Rudyard Kipling. He was born in in the middle of, you could say, the 19th century, and he lived on up to 1936. So 1865, most probably 1856 or 65, and he lived on to till 1936. And he was the famous author of The Jungle Book, which is a very famous, very popular story for or novel for children, which has also been made into a film. So Rudyard Kipling, being a very popular English writer, Ruskin Bond gives his reference here, and he wants to mean that this school in particular was functional in this particular place in Simla, on the outskirts of Simla, from before Kipling's time. That means way before Kipling was born. So this school was functional, or rather it would have all the norms, rules and regulations, and all the features of any school in Britain. So the same norms, rules and regulations were followed in this particular school, where Mr. Oliver worked as a teacher. Now, he gives examples. He talks about how the children of this school, those who attended the school, how they generally dressed. So he talks about blazers, caps, ties. So generally, children from wealthy Indian families would come to this school to study here. So this is the background of the school where Mr. Oliver worked. Life magazine, now it's a famous magazine published from England, from Britain. A Life magazine, in a feature on India, had once called it the Eton of the East. Now here, Eton or Eton, the correct pronunciation should be Eton, is a very prestigious school come college in Britain, and it is supposed to be one of the most premium educational institutions in Britain. And there's a reference given in your workbook, you can just go through. So in the Life magazine, this particular school, which has not been named here by the author, was compared to Eton of England, and it was compared and it was mentioned as the Eton of the East. Mr. Oliver had been teaching in the school for several years. The Simla Bazaar, with its cinemas and restaurants, was about 3 miles from the school, and Mr. Oliver, a bachelor, usually strolled into the town in the evening, returning after dark, when he would take a shortcut through the pine forest. Now, Mr. Oliver, being a bachelor and being a school teacher and living in this particular area, which was not very far from Simla town, Simla Bazaar, just about 3 miles from Simla Bazaar, where this school was located, he would take a walk in the afternoon, because normally the school gets over by afternoon, and then he is free. So he would take a walk and visit the market, Simla main town market, or the Simla Bazaar, and he would spend his time there because there were cinema halls, there were restaurants, and sometimes even just for no apparent reason, just for a casual walk to the town and back. That's the reason why Mr. Oliver would take a walk all the way to Simla Bazaar, and then would spend the entire afternoon there, and then by evening, once it was dark, he would start back to return back to the school. Now the thing is that while returning, he would not take the normal road, but a shortcut through the pine forest. Now this shortcut would bring him back to the school quicker than maybe the road, because the actual distance on the road was 3 miles, so he would take the shortcut through the pine forest. When there was a strong wind, the pine trees made sad, eerie sounds that kept most people to the main road. Now, because the wind would blow, Simla is a hill station and it's cold around the year, more or less, and windy as well because it is in the mountains, it's in the hills. And these pine trees would definitely make some sort of noise when the wind would blow through them. And local residents, local people, they somehow harbored some kind of fear that there was something inside those pine forests. So people would avoid taking the odd route through the pine forest. Rather, they would prefer to use the road. But not so much for Mr. Oliver, who was not scared of such things. He was not a superstitious man, and he was very, very rational in his thoughts. And so he would not think about doing anything else but take the shortcut. So most people kept to the road, to the main road, but not Mr. Oliver. Mr. Oliver was not a nervous or imaginative man. He carried a torch, and its gleam, the batteries were running down, moved fitfully down the narrow forest path. Now, this particular evening, as he was walking through the pine forest, returning to the school, it was a residential school where Mr. Oliver, as a teacher, would also be residing or used to reside along with the students, maybe. Maybe it was a residential, because normally hill schools are residential schools because wealthy children from wealthy families, Indian families, would come to study, and the hostel facilities had to be there, otherwise it would be difficult to run such a school. And Mr. Oliver had to return because perhaps he was also supposed to look after the students who lived in the campus. So as he was returning, and his battery, the torch battery, the batteries of the torch he was carrying were running down. The light was not very strong. And then suddenly this thing happened. When its flickering light fell in the figure of a boy who was sitting alone on a rock. Now that is the illustration which I showed to you in the beginning of this particular video. So you saw the black, silhouette or outline figure of a boy sitting on a rock. So that's exactly what he saw. He was sitting alone on a rock. Now Mr. Oliver stopped. Boys were not supposed to be out after dark. Now the hostelier boys, they were not supposed to come out of the campus after dark. During the daytime, yes, with permission, if they had some work in the town or for some reason they had to go out, they could go. But once it was dark, it was not expected that a boy from the school should be out here inside this pine forest, away from the campus. So that is what Mr. Oliver thought. He thought that it is one of the boys from his own school. So Mr. Oliver stopped. "What are you doing out here, boy?" asked Mr. Oliver sharply, moving closer so that he could recognize the miscreant. Now, Mr. Oliver is trying to understand who this boy is, which particular student it is, and he's asking this question, which is obvious. As a teacher, he will ask. So he tried to come closer to the boy, but even as he approached the boy, Mr. Oliver sensed that something was wrong. The boy appeared to be crying. His head hung down. He held his face in his hands. So Mr. Oliver couldn't see the boy's face because the boy was covering his face with his hands and crying. And his body shook convulsively. So his body was like it happens when somebody is crying or sobbing. There is a kind of movement in the entire body of the person when the person is crying. It was a strange, soundless weeping. There was no sound coming, but the movement of the body, and the face was covered with hands, hung down and covered with hands, proved that the boy was sobbing or crying. And Mr. Oliver felt distinctly uneasy. Now Mr. Oliver wondered what's going on, because there is no sound, but the boy is crying, the boy is not responding. So he's wondering. So that's the first page of the story. We move on to the next page. "Well, what's the matter?" he asked, his anger giving way to concern. "What are you crying for?" The boy would not answer or look up. His body continued to be racked with silent sobbing. "Come on, boy, you shouldn't be out here at this hour. Tell me the trouble. Look up." The boy looked up. Now this is where This is where the uncanny begins. This is where something very, very supernatural, something very, very horrifying takes place. When he is persistent, when he is constantly asking this boy to tell him who he was, why was he crying, why was he out there, suddenly the boy lifts his head and looks up. He took his hands from his face and looked up at his teacher. The light from Mr. Oliver's torch fell on the boy's face, if you could call it a face. Suspense. If you could call it a face. Why? What was so odd about that face? Why couldn't it be called a face? Let's find out. It had no eyes, ears, nose, or mouth. The face was absolutely plain. There was no nose, there were no eyes, there was no mouth. Imagine somebody looking up at you and there is no face. The entire forehead of the person seems to have come down up to the chin, and there are no other features visible on the face. It was just a round, smooth head with a school cap on top of it, and that's when the story should end. That's where the story should end, says Ruskin Bond, says the author. That the story should end here, leaving the rest to our imagination as to what could have possibly happened after that. It's left to the imagination of the reader. But for Mr. Oliver, it did not end here. The torch fell from his trembling hand. He turned and scrambled down the path, running blindly through the trees and calling for help. He was still running towards the school buildings when he saw a lantern. I have shown you a hand holding a lantern in the beginning of this video. It's this lantern in the dark. All he can see is a lantern swinging and approaching him. It's obviously the night watchman from the campus of his school. He saw a lantern swinging in the middle of the path. Mr. Oliver stumbled up to the watchman, gasping for breath. He was breathless. He was panting. And he comes up to the watchman and, "What is it, Sahib?" asked the watchman. "Has there been an accident? Why are you running?" The watchman is asking Mr. Oliver, "What is it, Sahib? Why are you running? Has there been an accident?" "I saw something horrible. A boy weeping in the forest, and he had no face." "No face, Sahib? No eyes, nose, mouth, nothing? Do you mean it was like this, Sahib?" asked the watchman and raised the lamp to his own face. The watchman had no eyes, no ears, no features at all, not even an eyebrow. And that's when the wind blew the lamp out. Isn't it? Isn't it a horrifying experience for Mr. Oliver? What do you think happens after this? Two successive visions, and in both cases, the result is the same. Two separate faces with no nose, no mouth, no eyes, not even eyebrows. So that is where Ruskin Bond leaves us. As a reader, it is now your turn to guess what could have possibly happened after this. Did Mr. Oliver faint? Did he die? Did he collapse? Or did he start running once again? Did he manage to reach the school? Did he manage to live to tell his story to his colleagues and the students and the other students living in the school inside the campus? We don't know. We don't know, we shall never know, because Ruskin Bond does not tell us. But like I said, the critical appreciation of this short story from your workbook, it's very important for you to go through. Let's go to that critical appreciation now. Let's see what the second paragraph says. Though it is said about Oliver that he is not a nervous or imaginative man, yet it is possible that out of his fear, anxiety, or loneliness, he might really be imagining some strange things. It is ironical that Oliver gets to see the face in the dark, and when the torchlight falls on the boy, he is rendered faceless without any nose, mouth, eyes, or ears. It can be inferred that human beings like Oliver experience bliss in ignorance. Till the time he is not aware of reality, he has concern for the boy. A moment later, the strange scene frightens him and he runs to save his life. Ruskin Bond's stories generally have revelation of many moments of loneliness and anxiety. It can also be read in a way that Oliver, now this is very important, being a bachelor is lonely and needs company, but all he gets is faceless faces. It might be possible that Oliver is looking for friends or family, but is not able to find them. That could be the greater or deeper implication of why he sees two such faces without features. But all that is left to us and for us to imagine, to analyze, and to believe. So that is where the story ends. I hope I have been able to explain the text of the story and also the background and the significance of what happens in the story. Thank you very much.